How's it going? In this video, I'm going to reveal the ultra deep secret that most people aren't really talking about or really understand the phenomenon or concept of. So, in this video, I'm just going to reveal what would happen if space didn't exist. Because I think it's a technicality that most people aren't paying attention to and realizing, how critical it is and how it's something that has to be there, and then everybody takes it for granted and they don't even really realize its importance and its significance. So first things first, I mean, when you're dealing with space itself, you have to understand it's more like a mechanism that allows for infinite amounts of memory, infinite amounts of storage. So we're literally at the mercy of space having to be there, having to exist. Because if space doesn't exist, nothing can exist, and that's the revelation of what this video is going to reveal. Is show like why nothing can exist if space doesn't exist, because space itself is the only, it's the most important part of the formula of how everything even exists. And that's why when everybody looks at it at the molecule level and you go zooming in, you realize how everything is glued together and holds itself together is through the phenomenon of space itself, because that's what space is. It's a storage, it's a memory. So when you get down to that Planck level, that Planck scale, and you realize how it turns into an electronic grid, and it's nothing can change it, and then it's like the wavelength. I believe they call it something like the wavelength. When you look at it, it exists in a way where it has all this strength. Like the desk, for example, right in front of me, it's solid, but in reality, when we look at it and we are seeing what it actually is, there's nothing that should stop this desk from just being a floppy piece of information or floppy piece of material, because when we look at it, that's what we see is, oh, it's just a wavelength. It's basically like a laser. It's like a hologram. And then in reality, when you look at something like that, I should be able to, like, let's say that this right here is my desk. If I, instead of like the desk holding its form for the most part, when I'm knocking on it, doom 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 doom, it doesn't do anything. In reality, I should be able to pinch that desk like right here, and then just wobble it up and down, and then it should be like a fishnet. It should be like a web, and it should have no structure or holding. But that's what space is for. That's what space is. That's what the job of space does, is when anything exists inside of space, that's where it glues and constructs its formation and its solid matter, because it remembers what it's supposed to be, because that's the only way anything can exist. Because if there isn't any space for something to exist in, then nothing can be put there. Because only if there's space for something to be put there can anything even be put there. Otherwise, if there's no space, nothing can be put there, because that's what space is. It stores, it's empty, it can be used by things that are going to occupy space. So space is for things to occupy it. So when people are forgetting about, oh, what it is and that it actually exists in the way that it exists, and they don't know why it exists in the way it exists, but it's just one of those things that it just has to be there because it's just the way it is. Because without space being there or existing, then nothing would be the way that we know it to be. Nothing, it would, if there was some other way that everything existed, first of all, we would already just have a different perspective based on whatever perspective would come out of that, which most likely would never be any perspective, because the only way to have any sort of perspective is when you get put into space or you begin to exist inside of space. So the only way for anything to ever exist is if it exists inside of space. So here's where I'm going to try to give a good example of how everything operates. So let's just say that this little black dot that I made right here is a representation of the Big Bang. So a lot of people hold on to the argument of, okay, well, all we need are infinite amounts of Big Bangs happening, and we already have a solution. But the problem is just because we want there to be infinite amounts of Big Bangs there doesn't mean that there are infinite amounts of Big Bangs there. Now, what people need to understand about this concept is just because I'm arguing that the infinite amounts of Big Bangs that everybody expects to be there doesn't necessarily have to be there right away. So everybody thinks, oh, that it's just going to be there right away. So that's the phenomenon of it. It's like, okay, well, it's true. It is true to an extent that there can be infinite amounts of Big Bangs because we have infinite amounts of space. So when you have infinite amounts of space, you can always just add another one, 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 add another one. So it's not that we can't have infinite amounts of Big Bangs. And that's where everybody gets confused, is they're like, oh, well, we know that we exist inside the phenomenon of where there can be infinite amounts of Big Bangs. But what people are failing to understand and realize is that the event is controlled. See, that's the biggest problem of the misconception, where the misconception of our existence comes in, is when you either, because you have to take on either one side or the other. You either have to believe that everything exists under control or without control. So the problem is we've come to discover, based on our science of nature, is without control of this sort of phenomenon, it won't be possible to exist. So only if it's under control. So if there's any way anyone can prove that, this event is not under control, then they can prove that there are infinite amounts of Big Bangs potentially happening right now. But nobody can prove that it's not under control, because it wouldn't make sense that the Big Bang is not under control for the amount of control that we see that it holds and that is capable of. So when someone takes on the argument is of the Big Bang is not under control, it's a random event occurring out of nothing having control over it, that's a personal belief. That's a religion. If you believe that these events are occurring without somebody having control over it. So you can't prove or really disprove it, but more or less you can prove it more than not. Because we have the nature to observe of what does something look like when it's under control, what are the dynamics of something that's happening that is under control. And anytime you look at the true nature of the Big Bang in our existence, it always points down to, oh, it's under control, it's under control. See, that's the thing, the phenomenon. We don't really know how it's under control. We don't know why it's under control. People just believe that there's so much random stuff happening that there's always going to reach a point to where it reaches control. But nobody can prove that it will ever reach the point of being randomly under control unless they can prove that, that it's completely random. The only way you can ever prove that it's completely random is if no one ever claims the ownership of the event. So just because someone doesn't claim the ownership of, hey, I did this, I'm the purpose, I'm the reason that anything even exists, that doesn't prove that at some point someone won't step up and say, hey, I'm the reason that everything's under control. Oh, I'm the reason. So, with the absence of nobody having control over the event, does not prove that it's not under control by someone or something or God himself. Obviously, I always argue that there's got to be a God, which this is the purpose of God, is to have everything under control. So, to take on an argument that, oh, as long as there's enough things going on, then we know that the event can always happen. See, that's what the other side of the argument is just taking for granted. They're just taking for granted, oh, that there's enough things going on. Okay, there's no evidence to suggest that there's infinite amounts of things going on, which when I am arguing that, when people are saying, oh, there's another Big Bang there, another Big Bang there, another Big Bang there, that's just hearsay. That's what someone is proposing and saying. I'm not saying that they aren't out there and that they don't exist, but another big problem with, let's say that there's another Big Bang over here, and somehow we find it out. See, everything that exists always makes it to a way that it becomes more unprobabilistic that anything could randomly exist. So that would only strengthen the existence of there having to be this having to be under control for the more universes that were technically in existence, because that's how our universe works, where if anything is any further or less away, then it can't exist. So if we do reach a point where we're like, oh, there is another Big Bang that is there, well then, by all means, we will now know for 100% certainty that has to be there, because that's how everything is. Everything has to be there. So that would only strengthen the evidence that there has to be a purpose and control over this whole existence, is if there's more universes. Because if that universe out in another galaxy or dimension outside of the next universe exists, then it has to exist for us to even exist. So then it strengthens the anthropic principle. So the anthropic principle always gets stronger, because everything that exists always has to exist even more. So it would just add to another coin flip of what has to be there, making the anthropic principle infinitely stronger. So if we ever did reach a point where we did see, oh, there's another universe out there, it would only be for the simple purpose that it has to be there. Because if that didn't exist, then we couldn't exist, because that's how everything is. So it would be a good sign to see more universes, but it would be a good sign to not see more universes, because it's a win-win. If you were not to see more universes, then we would know for a fact that there's not even a random chance that they could ever even happen. But if we reach a point where there are more and more universes, then we're going to reach a point where the anthropic principle just gets stronger and stronger. Because what would happen is, if when we look at the other universe and galaxy, we would realize, like, well, if that galaxy didn't exist and if it didn't do exactly what it was doing, then it would affect some sort of principle nature of our reality, to where nothing could hold itself together, because that has to be there. It's the same thing as, the sun having to be where it is, because if it's too far or too close, it's just not gonna work, because it all has to be exactly right. So it's a win-win for if there are to be more universes, which would be fine. It doesn't hurt us to have more universes if they have to be there. If the creator decided that he could make a purpose and a use for it. And that's probably why there's so much empty space in galaxies that have very little purpose or understanding of what is it supposed to be used for, is because that's our reality of nature. Our reality of nature revolves in a ocean of nothing, never making sense, because that's our reality, is nothing ever has made sense or nothing ever did make sense until God was able to make sense of it. So it's almost like looking at a hologram of our nature, of where there's always just another complexity in infinite amounts of things that are so perplexing that it's probably the way he designed it and created it, because in reality that's where we're coming from. We're coming from an existence where nothing is ever going to make sense if you don't really just know the truth. And knowing the truth is just that, well, there comes a point where everything has to be there. And we can prove that we live in an existence where something can't always be there, because we exist inside of space. And that's what space is something that was always there. So from what we've come to discover or know of, is that space always existed and always was there because it always had to be there. So now when we understand the whole concept of something can always be there and something has always been there, it doesn't seem so foreign and it's not as confusing as thinking, well, how can God always be there, when we know that, well, if it's always there, then it's always there. Or if it's never there, then it'll never be there. So that's the reality of space. So God is like space. But the thing about space is memory storage. So it's basically infinite empty hard drive. So the only way for anything to exist is if there was always infinite amounts of memory in space to put anything, and it had to have always been there. So that's what space is it's a hard drive. It's a computer storage that was always there, because it always had to be there, because we've discovered through the Big Bang that space is always there, but matter is created and doesn't always have to be there. So that's what we've discovered through this phenomenon when you scrutinize it and analyze it really close, is that space is something that cannot be created. You can't create space if it's already there. You can't create something if it's already there. Like if someone were to say, hey, go create the sun, you can't just go create another sun, because it's already there. Why? There wouldn't be a point to make another sun if it's already there. So that's the thing with space. If space is already there, you can't just go create more space. So no more space is never being created. If it's just already there, you're just getting access to it. You're getting further access to it, because there's always more and more space. So the good news about the misconception of the Big Bang on, oh, well, if there are infinite amounts of Big Bangs blowing up, then everything will eventually just create itself. But people aren't understanding. That's if you just use the circumstance that, oh, if you give everything enough time, that's what time is anything going on. Now you're gambling. You can't just say, oh, give something enough time, and then it'll always happen. That's what people are basically getting at with when they don't believe that there has to be a creator to existence. Is, oh, you just give anything enough time, anything will happen and everything will happen. But nobody can just say, oh, give it forever. See, that's the better way to say it, so you can actually understand what you're saying. Why would anybody give something forever if there isn't a purpose, or if we don't know that there even is forever to work with? So if you're going to give something forever, that's dumb, because now you're relying on if there's even anything else going on. And how's anybody going to ever even know if there's other things always going on if there ever reaches a point that there's nothing going on? And that's what the whole revelation of the Big Bang is you're always going to reach a point, whether or not there's another Big Bang or 20 bazillion other Big Bangs. You're going to reach a point that there's nothing ever going on. So now it comes down to the domino effect. If you reach a point that there's nothing going on, then who started doing anything to begin with? So now you're just gambling that there's always something going on. So that's stupid to say, oh, well, there's always something going on. Anybody can say, oh, there's always something going on, but our challenge to us is to know, well, what is going on and how is it going on? So if we can't know what is going on, or if we don't know how it's going on, it's a theory. You can't know anything outside of that spectrum of reality, besides just saying, oh, if there's always enough, yeah, of course, if there's always enough going on and going on and going on, anything can happen. But now the question you really got to ask yourself is how can you even be so sure that there's even anything going on? Because we know that there can always be nothing ever going on, because it's our reality. We've seen how space always exists, that forever space always existed. So if you go back quadrillion, bazillions, and bazillions, and bazillions, and bazillions of years ago, nothing ever changes. It's always the same. It's always just empty. Okay? So that's the revelation of space, is you can't create space. Space can't be created. It just has to always be there. So we're always at the mercy of, to exist as anybody or anything is to exist inside of space, period. You have to exist inside of space. So that's the revelation, and the secret of this is, if space doesn't always exist, then nothing will ever exist, because the only way for anything to exist is inside of space. Okay, so you exist inside of space, which is infinite amounts of memory, infinite amounts of storage. So there's never going to be a point where you run into a place where you can't store something in an empty location, because that's what space is for, is to occupy that space with something that occupies space. So space is to be occupied by something that can occupy space. So if there's no space, then nothing can occupy anything inside of space without space. Memory. So if there's no computer hard drive, that's where everybody's so confused. They're trying to say, oh, well, there's not a computer hard drive, anything can still exist. How do they get that? How does anybody get the conclusion that, oh, if there's not a hard drive, there's not any sort of storage, that anything can just exist? Because space can't create itself, because what we've seen of how it does exist, because the way space exists is that it always existed. It was always there. So space is not created. So we're at the mercy of it always having to be there, because it's not just going to create itself. Nothing is going to ever just create itself, because nothing can. Okay, so the whole revelation of the Big Bang that's the almighty power of God. That's how powerful he is. So it's not that there isn't a possibility that there are infinite amounts of universes that exist out there, because there could be, and the processor and the computer system that we exist inside of is strong enough to have infinite amounts of galaxies, and that's where everybody gets so convinced, oh, there has to be infinite amounts of universes and galaxies, because they know that it has the power to do that. But just because it has the power to do that doesn't mean it's there. That's like just trying to say, oh, just because we have the power to have 20 castles built, that we're just going to go build 20 castles when, maybe there's only more purpose for one castle. So why do we even need 20 castles? So the revelation of the Big Bang is there can always be infinite amounts of Big Bangs, but it's a matter of, is there a purpose to make that happen, or for it to even happen? Because if there's not a purpose for it, remember, anything that exists is always going to have a purpose. So even if we get outside of our universe and we start seeing, oh, there's another multiverse, there's another multiverse, there's another multiverse, all that's going to do is create more problems for there being a chance of a random source of creation. Because then you're going to have this Big Bang. Here, I'll show you. You're going to have this Big Bang that has a 1 out of quadrillion bazillion chance to exist, tied to this Big Bang that has 1 out of quadrillion bazillion chance to exist, which only makes everything more and more difficult for everything to keep existing. So if there's even more universes that exist, then we're in luck, because now we're going to know more of the evidence of there having to be a purpose, and this having to be under control. So there are only two sides of what's happening in our existence, is that everything is under control or nothing is under control. And from what we are observing, it makes more sense that everything is under control, because things keep doing what we expect it to do. Oh, we expect for when we walk out to our car that we're going to walk out to our car. So it's under control because it's what we are expecting. So that is what makes the most sense of why there has to be a God, is somebody has to have control over all this memory, all this storage. And the only way to write information to memory and storage is by writing it. So now the question is who wrote all that? Who wrote all that information? Because remember, when you see information that is neatly written, that makes sense, and that does things that, under operation, then that's a form of language. That's how you know someone wrote the information. So now the whole argument is everything being written or not written? Does everything look like does it look like it's being scribbled, or does it look like it's being written? When you look at a computer system, you realize how a computer operates and how it writes, and it just perfectly does everything without any sort of flaw. It's just perfectly accurate. Computers, they're not sloppy. They don't go scribbling stuff around. So if we looked around and we noticed that everything was like scribbly, now we would take on. It would make more sense to take on a belief that this is all scribble. Nothing makes any sense. It all looks like trash. But nothing is like that. Nothing looks trashy. Granted, there are certain circumstances, accidents happen, but I'm saying overall, it doesn't look like, oh, that's an accident, that's an accident, that's an accident. Like, when I just hold my soda, it doesn't just turn into a glob of lava. That's what scribbling looks like, is if something just randomly happens that no one even knows why or what the fuck is going on. But everything we're looking at, we know why it's going on or what the fuck is going on, and we can conceive it. Although deep down, you always get to a point where, no one really knows what the fuck is going on. And that's the problem. So when anybody tries to rely on the whole, oh, just give it enough time, and if there's always more going on, it'll always happen. But that's stupid, because if anyone just takes on the argument, oh yeah, there's always just enough going on. Now you're just saying, oh, if there's enough going on, then anything can happen. But that doesn't explain anything, to just say, oh, if there's always something going on, then there's always going to be something going on. That's more or less all that they're simplifying their statements down to is, oh, well, if something's going on, then something's going on. But the question is what the hell is going on? Why the hell is it going on? And how the fuck is it going on? So those are the three questions most people are avoiding is the how, why, and what the fuck is going on. Because their whole argument is, well, if it's going on, that's all we need to know is it's going on. But you don't even know that that's even going on because you can't prove that that's going on. The only way you can prove that it's going on is if you understand how it's happening or what it's doing or why it's doing it. So there's not even any sort of formula to, oh, well, this evolves into this when nothing happens. Because now if you start trying to analyze evolution, you're going to need to know infinite amounts of information, infinite amounts of knowledge, which is inaccessible. We don't have access to infinite amounts of information because we only barely just began to exist. Only if you always existed would you have infinite amounts of access to knowledge of what's actually happening. So no one's ever going to be able to know what the fuck is actually happening or going on or why the fuck it's going on unless you always existed. You would have to always exist to know everything, or there would have to be something that made sense besides just saying, oh, well, it's just going on. That's all that they're saying is they're just saying, oh, because I'm saying that it's going on, that it's going on. That doesn't solve any answers. That doesn't provide any solutions, nor does it make any sense to just say, well, if something's going on, then it's always just going to go on. That's the entire point of trying to figure out what the fuck is going on, is because we know that there's things going on that nobody really understands. But now the challenge is to figure out why is it going on? How is it going on? And what the fuck is going on? So when people are failing to even resolve those answers and provide those answers, how is it going on? Why is it going on? They don't answer anything. They just basically they're basically doing what I can do. I could do the same thing. That, oh, well, they just want to say if enough time goes on, if there's enough going on, anything will always happen. Everything will always happen. So that they're basically saying that anybody can make up anything they want to and they will be right. Because that's what their belief is that if there's always enough going on, that it'll always eventually be going on. So how does that make any sense that if everybody can just make something up and be fucking right? Because that's what their belief is anybody who makes up whatever the fuck they want to make up will always be right, because it'll always eventually go on. That doesn't solve any answers. That doesn't provide any solutions. It doesn't make any fucking sense to just say, oh, well, if you want to answer any question you ever have about anything, any question can always be answered, because after enough time goes on, the solution will reveal itself. And no one can prove that. No one can prove that the answer will just show itself and answer itself. How can anybody try to argue that the answer will just answer itself if nothing ever comes up with the answer? If nothing ever comes up with the fucking answer, then nothing will ever come up with the fucking answer. We know that to be our reality because we already know that space always existed. So we already know it's possible for something to never happen or always happen. So it can be on one side or the other. So when someone tries to argue that, oh, that's always something that can happen, why are they just so one-sided saying that's something that can always happen when we know that there are things that could never happen, though? So why shouldn't we be jumping onto one side thinking, oh, that's something that can never happen, but then their answer is that it's always something that can always happen. So if their answer is that there's always something that can always happen, then how do they get the right to call anybody wrong if anything can always happen? So if I can always be right with anything I fucking say or make up, how do they get the authorization to deny my truth or reality or theory based on them saying, oh, well, that can never happen, because they're the ones who can say what can never happen or what can always happen? So all of a sudden, when I come up with a theory and say what I fucking believe is the truth, oh, that can never happen because we know the absolute truth. See, that's bullshit. Because they authorize everybody to be right. That everybody will always come up with a useful solution because every solution is useful. But that's not true, because we know that every solution is not useful, because it's our reality where solutions have to be very specific in order to be a solution. You can't just have a solution without it being a solution. And then all these people want to just call something a fucking solution without it even being a solution. A solution makes sense. A solution solves problems. A solution creates answers. So if your solution doesn't create answers, solve problems, make sense, you don't have a solution. That's what everyone's trying to say. Oh, I have the solution. By saying that the universe can just infinitely create itself, because they say that's the solution. So they're basically saying that all answers will always answer themselves. So if all answers will always answer themselves, then why the fuck won't my answer answer itself? But you're denying my answer an answer because your answer is the only answer, since you're the only one who knows anything. See, that's the problem with taking too scientific of approach to this stuff, because you can always complicate something further and further. And the only way anything is ever supposed to be is where if it's simple enough to be used, if we can make sense of it, if we can use it, or if there's a purpose for it. That's what our evolution of science is all about. Hey, if we can't use it, we're not going to be using it. And why do you think we advance in science? Is because we only deal with something, oh, that's beneficial, it's useful. So when all of a sudden the answer is that, oh, no one needs to have an answer to anything because the answer will always answer itself, that is not an answer that's reliable. That's the problem. That's not reliable. We're looking for something that's reliable. So the revelation is space did not always exist. Nothing would ever exist, because the only way for anything to exist is inside of space, because that's all we know. That's just what we know of. Unless we know of anything else. And remember, you can only know something that you have perception of or know of. So you can't just guess that, a bacterial life is conscious enough to even matter. Because when they can't perceive or process enough information, that doesn't even matter. The only way anything matters is if there's enough going on to where it begins to matter. Okay, so the whole revelation of space is the only way for anything to exist is inside of space, period. Because if anything exists outside of space, so anything outside this circle, let's just say we have infinite amounts of occupiable space. So when we're looking at occupiable space, that means that there's room to put something there that can occupy that space. So if there is no space, then everything outside of it is unoccupiable. That's all it means, is to exist outside of space. Do you exist inside of an unoccupiable space? So as far as we know of, there is no such thing as the existence of unoccupiable space. Because if we ever reached a point where, oh, there's unoccupiable space, then there won't be enough room for anything to exist. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be like that. It's just that from what we know of, from what we've seen. So that's another thing that people are kind of confused about is like, well, what exists outside of space? Well, if anything exists outside of space, it's occupying it and no one's going to know because it's outside. It's unoccupiable. And that's what unoccupiable is nothing can be put there. It's not a place that you can reach. So if this is unoccupiable space, it cannot be reached, period. Why do you think getting outside of space cannot be reached? Is because when you're inside of space, it's always infinite amounts of occupiable space. So when you always have more occupiable space, you can't reach a location where it's, oh, that's unoccupiable space, because there's always more empty room, because that's the way it has to be. There has to be infinite amounts of space for anything to exist. So that's the revelation. I'm going to just sum this up real quick. So the whole revelation of the Big Bang is that the creator of, the simulation, the computer, he has infinite amounts of ability to just keep writing as much information into space as he wants to. Because there's always going to be more and more room that he can always just keep making more. So there's never any chance that he's going to reach a point where, oh, I have unoccupiable space because I ran out of room. That's what happens when you reach unoccupiable space, is you run out of room. So he can't run out of room because he always had infinite amounts of space. Why do you think he has so much goddamn space and memory that he can work with? Because that's what God is somebody who's infinite, someone who's all-powerful, someone who had infinite amounts of space. So the good news and the bad news about the paradigm behind the Big Bang is the computer system that we are inside of, it has enough power to create infinite amounts of Big Bangs. We're talking infinite. Quadrillions of bazillions times 10 times 10, always times 10 times 10. So that's the good news. So the creator, he can keep creating more and more shit if we need more. So it's just a matter of if there's a reason. Is there any fucking reason? Because remember, we can always have infinite amounts of space to put more shit. The question is what more shit do we need to put out there, and is there a reason? Is there anybody occupying it? Because we're the ones who occupy space. So the only ones who occupy space are the ones who exist inside of it. Okay, so everyone probably reached a point in the infinite simulations in the past where everyone was so worried about, oh, we're going to run out of space, because we're multiplying by, bazillions of people per day, that everyone's probably started worrying like, oh, we're going to run out of space. But God was like, guys, we're not going to run out of fucking space because we have infinite amounts of space. Okay, so the revelation is space cannot create itself. It has to always exist. It has to always be there. Same with God. God cannot create himself. He has to always be there. He has to always exist. Okay, so that's why everyone's so confused about how the fuck can God always be there? And that's our biggest thing that we finally have come to realize is, well, if something is always there, then it can always be there. But that's the only way it can be, is if it is always there. So the only way for God to have ever been there or existed is if he was always there. So as far as that we know of, he had to have always been there, because God is by definition the ruler over everything that gets written into space or created into space. because that's what God is defined as, is the ruler of all memory, the ruler of all space. So now, whenever anybody takes on the whole concept that it doesn't make sense that there has to be a God or there can be a God, because it doesn't make sense that someone or something can always exist. Bullshit. If it always existed, it always existed, and it can always exist. But that's the only way, is if it always existed. So that's like someone trying to argue that space didn't always exist or can't always exist. Why the fuck can't space always exist if it's always there? So we know that space can always exist because it's always there. It's always been there. Okay, so now we know that it's possible for something to always exist, but it has to always be there. So now why wouldn't we conclude that God always has been there if we already know that that's the nature of our phenomenon? So that's where, final thing I'm going to wrap up. I've said it a million times in this video, but when someone's just trying to argue that, oh, you give time, if you give anything enough time, it'll always just keep happening and keep happening and keep happening and keep happening, and then everything will always answer itself. But we already know that, well, if space didn't always exist, then it will never exist. That's reality. That's what we know. So now it doesn't make any sense to say, hey, well, if you give something infinite amounts of time, it'll always just happen. So now that's like trying to take on an argument that, oh, if space never existed, if you just keep giving it enough time, more stuff going on, that it'll spontaneously just exist. But that's not reality, because we know that it's the opposite, that it always had to exist and it always did exist, because if it didn't always exist, then it would never exist. So now we understand the concept that things can never happen and things can never exist if it just so happens to be that they never do exist, or something never happens. So now when someone just is trying to say, oh, well, if it happens, it'll happen, no one really knows if it will actually happen unless you know that it will actually happen. So when someone's just gambling, when you just keep going on for infinite amounts of time, it will happen. But you can't know that it will happen unless you see it, observe it, and know that, or if there's any sort of evidence. But there's no evidence to suggest that, and we would have evidence of that if we could see that space was creating itself. Because if we saw that, space is growing, space is like a blob and it's creating itself, now we would know, space creates itself. So now we know that anything can just keep creating itself. But we already know that space doesn't just keep creating itself, because it always existed and it was always there. And since that's the phenomenon of what the truth is, that it always existed and it was always there, we know that if it was never there, then it would never be there. It would never create itself, because we know that it was always there. So if we know that it was always there, then we know that if it was never there, then it would never be there. So that's the phenomenon, is if it was never there, it would never be there, because it always had to be there. So that's why every time that we exist in our perception, we can take into a relative, space is getting older, but that's into our perception. But in reality, space is infinitely going on. So now, no matter how long we exist, space always existed infinitely longer. So that's what it means, is if nothing can ever happen, or something will never happen, or something always has to be there. Is if nothing is never gonna happen, then nothing will never ever happen. Ever. So we were always at the mercy of space always having to be there, which is the same thing as like just saying that the sun had to always be there. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. Everything is like that. So when somebody feels like it's easier for space to be created or exist, that's just your personal belief that you think that it's easier for space to create itself rather than the sun to create itself or matter to create itself. Just because you think that it's easy for space to create itself doesn't mean that it's easy. In fact, it's impossible. Space can never just create itself because that's just not the reality that was always there. Now, when you're just trying to say, oh, space can just create itself, you're just trying to change the reality of our nature that was always the way it was. That's the way it always was. So how is all of a sudden everything going to just change? Just because somebody wants to say what they want to say or feel how they feel. Oh, just because I feel like space can just create itself, now we're just going to say that space can create itself. But that's never the way it's ever been. It's never been like that, to where something can just create itself out of nothing. So now you're just taking on an argument that you have 0.000000000000000 infinite amounts of zeros with the one followed by it of a chance of even being right, and you're sitting there holding on to your argument like you know what you're talking about, or you know the truth of reality. But the truth of reality is space always had to be there. So when someone tries to argue anything other than that, you're being foolish, you're being stupid, because that's not the way things always were. The way things always were is that it was always there. So if it's always there, there's no evidence to suggest that it never had to always be there. Because if it was never there at any point, you would never reach a point ever where it would ever just exist or happen. So anyway, the people who believe that the Big Bang is not under control or there's no purpose to the universe, they just believe in all actuality that anybody can propose an idea or a solution, and given enough time, their solution or answer will always make sense or be true. So that's why I argue it's foolish to take on that belief to say that anybody and everybody can be right just by if they make up anything that they make up. Because that doesn't make sense. It's foolish to think, oh, anybody can be right about anything that they want to make up. Because all we need to know is that infinite amounts of things are going to happen. Okay, so if infinite amounts of things are going to happen, and all solutions and answers are going to be answered, that means no one's right, no one's fucking wrong. That doesn't make sense. How can anybody take on the whole concept or belief that someone can't be wrong or someone cannot be right when that's all we know of. That's all that we've ever known it to be, is that someone can be right or wrong. Okay, so don't be fooled by somebody who says, oh, after infinite amounts of time keep going on and on and on and on and on, everything will just keep happening over and over and over again. Of course, it's a possibility, but it's not a solution. It's not an answer that's reliable to think that we should believe that that's what's actually happening or going to happen. Of course, it's a good theory to kind of just throw out there, but it should only be just something that we take with a grain of salt, because we just know that it's not really the dynamic of our nature. But it's still plausible to somewhat consider, but by any means to take serious would be foolish, because now anybody can be right. In fact, their argument about how everything can create itself and everything can solve the answer to itself makes me right. They're saying I'm correct, because that's what they believe. They believe that everybody's correct. Everybody will be right because there is not wrong. There cannot be anything wrong. So all of a sudden, if they're trying to say that nothing can ever be wrong, then how do they get the audacity or the courage to come challenge me for being wrong when they specifically dictate there is no wrong? There cannot be wrong. So all of a sudden, they say two things. They only want to say what they want to be right and what they want to believe. And then if nobody believes what they believe, they just kick them in the dust and say, well, since you don't believe what I believe, you're stupid. That's basically all they're doing, is saying you have to believe what I believe since what I believe is true. And I believe it's true because I say it's true, and that's what makes it true, is because I say it's true. So that's the only thing that makes anything true. The only thing that makes anything true is if somebody says it's true. Period. That's it. Is if someone says it's true. That's the only thing that makes it true. So if they say it's true, well then fuck, it's goddamn true because they fucking said it's true. Same with me. That's what their argument is. That's their belief of reality, is whoever says what the fuck is true is what the fuck is true. Alright, fine. That's what they believe. Then what the fuck I say is true. That's what reality is. Because that's what I said is fucking true. Because that's what I believe. That's what I know. So I can't be wrong. Because that's what their belief is it's based on what somebody says is true. So I can't be fucking wrong based on what they've said. So that must mean I have to be right. I'm the only one that can be right. Because from what I've argued is that they are wrong and that there can be wrong. So I don't agree with that concept of anybody being able to say that they're right. But since that's what they want to say, hey, anybody can say what they want, and if they say that's the truth, then that's the truth. Then I'm going to use that to my power, to my advantage, because that's what they dictate as making something true, is if somebody says it's true. It just matters is if somebody says it's true. Doesn't even have to be true. All that matters is if somebody argues and says it's true. Well, guess what? I say what I say is true and makes sense, so therefore it's true. It's the answer. Now, when you go to their fucking answer, they don't have any solutions. Doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't explain what is happening. That's the biggest problem with these people coming out with the solution is it doesn't explain what is happening. Why is it happening? My answer explains why is it happening. How is it happening? Therefore, my solution makes more sense because I said it's true, because I understand it, and it's what makes the most sense. Remember, space is something that always had to be there. So when someone tries to argue otherwise, that something never has to be there, that they're foolish, because we know that something always has to be there. Because we see it. It's in front of us. It always has to be there. So when someone tries to they're taking on the argument that something doesn't always have to be there. That's what they're arguing, is something doesn't always have to be there. Their argument is that if space never existed, that it doesn't always have to be there because it can exist. That's not true, because our reality points to the opposite of what they believe. That's why I think they're so stupid. It's the opposite of what they say. We know that space always has to be there, but they're trying to say that it doesn't. They're trying to say it doesn't always have to be there. Why doesn't it always have to be there? Because they're just saying that any time, any place, anything can happen, and it'll happen when it happens. But we know that that's not the way it always was. The way it always was is that it was always there. So now that we know that it was always there, why would anybody believe that it would never have to always be there? Because now if you believe that it doesn't always have to be there, you believe that space can create itself. But we already know that space didn't create itself. So how can anyone try to argue that space can create itself if it never had to create itself or never did create itself? Why would anybody try to take on an argument that space needs to be created when we already have a final solution to what something is? And you can't change that. You can't change that space doesn't need to be created. Or there's no way to prove that space can just be created, because it was always there. So when someone tries to take on the argument that space doesn't always have to be there, they're going against the way things always were. If something was always there, you can't just say that it never needed to be there. That's all they're saying is, oh, well, space never needed to always be there. Okay, so where are they getting any evidence that space never needed to always be there, when we already know that it always had to be there and always was there? How do they get the opposite side of the argument?